GLP-1 medications. Yes, that includes semaglutide, tirzepatide, and retatrutide. Even though retatrutide is not available in retail pharmacies, it is still available in multiple compounded pharmacy sources. Get a hold of Prestige 2.0, www.prestige20.com, and we can help you identify where it is appropriate to get Prestige retatrutide, whether that's a Prestige 2.0 or somewhere else. All right, so let's wait a few minutes and then we will begin. We are, of course, waiting for Facebook Live and other social media platforms before we begin. And now let's get the chat going. So we already have a chat. Sure thing. All right. And what is your question? All right. So the question is, how can we obtain retatrutide at Prestige 2.0? Well, the key thing to understand is that while retatrutide is not FDA cleared or registered or approved, whatever is the appropriate designation for retail-based consumption, it is still available through other direct pharmacy measures of which Prestige 2.0 has been privy to. And the key thing to understand here is, what is the appropriate measure by which retatrutide would be clearly beneficial? Well, the key thing to understand is that retatrutide is of the same class as semaglutide, tirzepatide, and retatrutide. So the mechanism of action is well known. Now, whether Eli Lilly or other pharmaceutical manufacturers are engaging in anti-competitive practices, what have you, whether retatrutide should be available in synthetic or compounded form, those are questions that are more at the policy level. But at the direct patient care level and at the direct patient research level, retatrutide is readily available and it is an appropriate mechanism of action when it comes to losing weight for those particularly who are interested in losing weight the right way using the latest evidence-based medicine, whether that's for research or for true clinical purposes. All right, so thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate that question. So early in the conversation, I think what we want to do now is really focus on what is the purpose of today's discussion, and that is understanding oral versus injectable medications and understanding really what is the difference between the mechanism of action and essentially what is considered the pharmacokinetics of injectable versus oral medications. So before we kind of jump in and kind of delve into the biopharmacokinetics, let's I guess address a few questions that might be at hand right now. And so if you look at the questions here, let's see, I'm going to the Q&A, to the polls. Okay, so retatrutide, oral versus injectables, perfect. All right, so let's just jump into the question at hand here, and that's really, what is the pharmacokinetics of oral versus injectable medications, and what is the actual benefit that we can see, right? So I think the key thing here is to really understand what it means to have intravenous versus pharmacokinetic versus oral, and what is the mechanism of action. So let me kind of just jump into the presentation so that we can get a good sense of what's going on. So the clinical pharmacokinetics of oral semaglutide. Big words, fancy words. Let's go into this at a very simple and straightforward level. So when you inject semaglutide into your body, essentially what you're doing is taking a medication, injecting it into a lipidus field, the fascial tissue, and then allowing it to spread, disseminate throughout the entire body. In the same vein, when you're orally ingesting a medication, you are ingesting it, enabling it to go through an entire alimentary canal, the digestive system, in which it then spreads to the entire body. Both have different mechanisms of action. Both have different means by which the medications would then come to an effect. But the key thing to understand here is that while it may seem like there's really not that much of a difference, what you have to understand is that when it comes to the total bioavailability of the medications, the differences start to become more pronounced. And let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Oral semaglutide. So when you initially take the first dose of the oral semaglutide, it doesn't actually hit peak volume until the 10th day. That is in contrast to injectable semaglutide, in which the peak concentration is at the moment the injection took place. So you would not see this gradual inclination. In fact, you would see a quite rapid inclination and then a downstream push, just like what you see here. So you see the semaglutide increase rapidly and then decrease, as opposed to the oral semaglutide, in which there is a slower increase but a much more gradual decrease. Now, what is the impact of that? Well, the impact of that really comes down to how you, as the patient, are internalizing the semaglutide into your body. What does that mean? So, how do you internalize medicine? And why am I using the terminology in this way? That's a key point for us to understand here, because GLP-1 medications are unlike any other medications in that the effect is both objective and subjective, in that objectively, yes, you are losing weight. You can see that based on numbers on the scale. But the true benefit comes from a subjective assessment that's very different from antihyperglycemic medications, diabetes drugs, from antihypertensive drugs, from blood pressure drugs. The key recognition here is that there is no objective metric. It is inherently subjective, and that is why clinical oversight is more paramount than other medications, because you really want to make sure that you're keeping track of how the medications are working over time. If you see a more gradual peak and a more gradual decline, like with oral medications, well, that simply means that the GLP-1 medication has less of a impact early on, but its impact remains. Now, if you're taking injectable medications, in which the impact is very pronounced, but then rapidly decreases, well, you're going to notice that in how you perceive the different impacts of the hunger complex. So that's the key recognition here, right? What is hunger complex, and how do you subjectively understand hunger complex relative to food noise? Yeah, and Brandon, we will definitely get to your question. Let me just finish up this point and then we'll get to that. So, what is hunger noise relative to objective and subjective understandings of the GLP-1 medications? So, objectively, it's you either lose weight or you don't lose weight, and that's just the end of it, right? Regardless of the anti-inflammatory effects, regardless of anything that's going on, that's not necessary in what we value in terms of GLP-1 medications. What we value is we lose weight or not, objectively. Now, fair enough. Subjectively, which I would argue is more important, is what we value in terms of the hunger complex, in terms of our ability to say no to certain foods and certain food-based items that we know are adverse to our overall body health. And that's the key factor here. How easy is it for us to lose weight? And for us to look at weight in that mechanism, all of a sudden now it requires a more holistic perspective of the hunger complex. Food is dopamine. Food is serotonin. Food has so many emotional components to it that when you start to look at food noise from that framework, all of a sudden now you're looking at something that's more than just hunger and hunger complex. It's about the emotional relationship to food. And when you think about it in that vein, you also start to realize that the GLP-1 medications, while they may not see an immediate loss in weight, the benefits that they may come from a better control of food, better control of the dopaminergic, the serotonergic relationships to food, that's the key impact here. And that's why oral GLP-1 medications are so critical because they help to remind the body that, hey, we are taking a medication that help alleviate the effects of the medications. All right, let's see. Brandon. All right, well, I appreciate that. All right, any other questions or anything, or should I continue when you talk about the oral medications? All right, let's see. Okay. All right, so let's go over GLP-1 medications, I think in a little bit more detail. And I see your question, so we will definitely answer that. And I think kind of going through the question writ large would help us answer that. So GLP-1 medications are medications that ultimately help to regulate blood sugar, glucose rather, and by reducing the average blood sugar levels, the glycemic index, help to promote weight loss by focusing on fat metabolism than carbohydrate metabolism. Now, we know about the injectable versions of the medications, but what the oral medications provide, beyond just the convenience, is higher bioavailability. And let's go over that. So, we talked about the graphs, right? We talked about the rapid increase, and then we talked about the decrease with the injectable GLP-1 medications. We talked about the slower increase and the slower decrease with the oral GLP-1 medications. How do the two correlate? The key thing to recognize here is that if you are to combine injectable versus oral GLP-1 medications, you would then be able to have the peak benefit of injectable GLP-1 medications with the delayed decrease of the oral GLP-1 medications, which is critical because if you are looking at medications to help from the subjective assessment of food noise, of weight loss, combining the oral versus the injectable GLP-1 medications gives you precisely what you need to help you lose weight. Perfect. Thanks so much for your support. All right, perfect. Any other questions or anything? And I'm looking at my phone. I'm also looking at the computer. Any other questions or anything for me? Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Any other questions or anything for me? Just let me know and then we can continue the conversation. Thank you.